A toddler goes missing from her home, and her mother tells a shocking story of a kidnapping by a nanny. As the investigation deepened, the mother's story changed again and again, each version more perplexing than the last. But as the weeks went on, they discovered strange clues that didn't add up. The truth about what happened to her remained hidden, until it all came to light in an unexpected way. Caylee Marie Anthony was born on August 9, 2005, in Orlando, Florida. To the outside world, she was an energetic and joyful toddler, loved by her family and admired by everyone around her. Living with her mother, Caylee Anthony, and her maternal grandparents, George and Cindy Anthony, Caylee was the center of attention. She was a happy child, with a big smile and a natural charm that made her unforgettable. Caylee's relationship with her mother, Caylee, appeared to be a loving one at first glance. Caylee often posted pictures of her daughter on social media, portraying a mother-daughter bond that seemed unbreakable. However, there were subtle hints that painted a very different picture behind the closed doors of their home. Caylee, while a mother, was also known for her partying lifestyle. She was often seen socializing with friends, attending clubs, and living a life that seemed far removed from the responsibilities of motherhood. On the surface, the family home seemed like a typical suburban residence. The lawn was neatly trimmed, and the house was well kept. It was the kind of place where one might expect to hear the laughter of children running through the yard. But despite the outward appearance of normalcy, a darker undercurrent was beginning to emerge. Caylee was incredibly close to her grandparents, George and Cindy Anthony. They adored her and often took part in her care, doting on her and playing a central role in her upbringing. Cindy was particularly close to Caylee, often expressing her deep affection and protective nature. But their relationship with Caylee was more complicated. While Cindy and George were committed to their granddaughter's well-being, they often found themselves at odds with Caylee's behavior. On July 15, 2008, Caylee Marie Anthony was reported missing. But the chilling part of the story came when Caylee's mother, Cindy, called 911 to report that her granddaughter was nowhere to be found. She had not seen Caylee for over 30 days. During the 911 call, Cindy Anthony expressed her shock and disbelief. She was frantic, trying to explain that her daughter, Caylee, had given her numerous explanations for Caylee's disappearance, each story more confusing than the last. Cindy told dispatchers that she had only just learned the truth from Caylee. According to Cindy, Caylee had been reluctant to reveal that Caylee had been missing for a month. She reported that Caylee seemed completely unaffected by the situation, despite the fact that her daughter had vanished without a trace. Caylee had been living in the family home with her parents, but when authorities arrived to speak with her, she gave a series of troubling and contradictory statements. At first, she claimed that Caylee had been kidnapped by a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, a woman who, according to Caylee, had been caring for her daughter. The problem? Investigators could find no trace of a nanny by that name. They discovered that the apartment she allegedly lived in had been vacant for over 140 days. With each lead Caylee provided, the story seemed to fall apart. The nanny who had supposedly been a regular part of their lives didn't exist. No one could corroborate Caylee's story. Police grew more skeptical of her account, but there was something even more alarming that would soon be discovered: a strange smell in Caylee's car. On July 15, when Caylee's father, George Anthony, went to retrieve the family car from an impound lot, he noticed an overwhelming odor. He described it as the unmistakable smell of decomposition. According to George, the stench was so strong that it lingered in his mind long after he had opened the trunk. Upon inspecting the car, the police discovered something even more unsettling. The trunk was filled with garbage, but no one could explain the foul smell. It wasn't long before investigators linked this odor to human decomposition. The discovery of the smell in the car opened the door to even more questions. Why would a mother be so detached from the disappearance of her child? Why would she lie so extensively about what had happened? And why had it taken so long for her to report Caylee missing? As the authorities continued their investigation, they began to piece together a timeline that didn't align with Casey's story. With each passing day, more contradictions emerged. Caylee continued to lie, even when confronted with evidence. The more the authorities pressed her, the more her story changed. One moment, she claimed Caylee had been kidnapped. The next, she said she had dropped her off with a nanny. Casey's refusal to cooperate and the mounting evidence pointing to lies only intensified suspicions. As the investigation went on, the web of lies surrounding Caylee Anthony grew ever more tangled. Every new statement she made seemed to contradict the last, and each piece of information brought more questions. Caylee claimed she was working at Universal Studios, a well-known entertainment company in Orlando. But when detectives visited Universal Studios to verify her story, they found something troubling. Caylee hadn't worked there in over 2 years. Her story was already starting to fall apart. Caylee had told investigators that she was employed there, claiming to have been working on some project that required her to be away from home. However, when police asked to see her office and speak with colleagues, they were told she hadn't worked there for 2 years. Her entire story about being employed at Universal Studios was fabricated, an attempt to divert attention away from her actions and mislead the authorities. Caylee's false claims didn't end with her employment. Every answer she gave seemed more bizarre than the last. She insisted that her daughter had been with a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, a woman who, as the investigation revealed, did not exist. When authorities started questioning Caylee further, they found more discrepancies, leading them to conclude that she was not telling the truth about the disappearance of her daughter. On August 11, 2008, Roy Kronk, a meter reader who worked in the area near the Anthony home, noticed something unusual. While walking through a wooded lot on the property, he spotted what appeared to be a bag. At first, Kronk didn't think much of it. But something caught his eye, a skull, partially visible. He immediately called the police, but his report was dismissed initially. Little did he know that this was the first clue leading to the discovery of Caylee's remains. Kronk's first call to the police was dismissed, and when he called again, he was met with similar indifference. His second attempt did not initially spark a full-scale investigation. In fact, it wasn't until he contacted police for a third time, on December 11, 2008, that the authorities responded seriously. This time, they sent officers to the location where Kronk had reported finding the suspicious object. The remains of 2-year-old Caylee were discovered in a trash bag, buried in a wooded area, just a short distance from her family's home. But the most disturbing part of this discovery wasn't just the location. It was the evidence surrounding her body. Among the skeletal remains, investigators found duct tape near Caylee's skull, a piece of evidence that would later prove to be a critical clue. The duct tape was not just an incidental detail, it was an indication of foul play. The tape appeared to have been placed directly over her mouth and nose before decomposition had set in, suggesting that Caylee's death was not an accident. This discovery, combined with the condition of the remains, left little room for doubt. This was no accidental drowning, as Caylee had initially claimed. Further forensic analysis revealed chilling details. Medical examiner Dr. Jan Garavaglia, who performed the autopsy, determined that the cause of death could not be definitively determined but ruled the death as homicide by undetermined means. The absence of any obvious injuries or trauma left investigators with few clear answers, but the presence of the duct tape and the decomposed state of the body spoke volumes. The medical examiner's ruling of homicide by undetermined means was, at the time, both frustrating and telling. It left the door open for further investigation while pointing to the fact that Kaylee's death was not natural. This ruling, combined with the discovery of the duct tape, gave the prosecution their first solid indication that this wasn't just a tragic accident, this was a deliberate act. As the investigation continued, another shocking piece of evidence emerged: chloroform was discovered in Kaylee's car. Chloroform is a powerful chemical compound that can cause unconsciousness, and when used in a particular way, it can suffocate a person. This discovery linked directly to the allegations that Kaylee's death may have been caused by suffocation. The presence of chloroform in Kaylee's car wasn't just incidental. The amount of chloroform found in the vehicle raised significant questions. Investigators believed that it could have been used to incapacitate Kaylee. This discovery, along with the duct tape found on her remains, pointed to suffocation as a likely cause of death, though no conclusive proof was found at that time. Despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, chloroform in the car, duct tape on the child's mouth, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding Kaylee's disappearance, the exact details of what happened in those final moments of her life remained unclear. Was the chloroform used to subdue her, or was it applied after her death to mask the odor of decomposition? These were questions that would continue to linger throughout the investigation. The more investigators dug, the more contradictions emerged. Kaylee's statements about what happened to her daughter were increasingly hard to believe, and her refusal to cooperate made it difficult for the authorities to piece together a coherent narrative. Each piece of evidence, from the duct tape to the chloroform, painted a grim picture of a mother who seemed to be hiding something. But what happened in those final hours remained a mystery. The investigation into Kaylee's death became a race against time, as every new discovery seemed to lead to more questions. Was the duct tape used as a method of restraint before her death, or was it applied afterward to seal her fate? And how had the chloroform made its way into Kaylee's car? These questions would become central to the trial that would follow, as prosecutors worked to piece together the truth from the overwhelming amount of evidence pointing to Kaylee's involvement. Caylee Anthony was arrested on charges of giving false statements to law enforcement, child neglect, and obstruction of a criminal investigation. The judge denied bail, saying Kaylee had shown woeful disregard for the welfare of her child. On July 22, 2008, after a bond hearing, the judge set bail at $500,000. A month later, Kaylee was released from the Orange County Jail after her $500,000 bond was posted by Tony Padilla, the nephew of California bail bondsman Leonard Padilla. However, when an angry crowd began to gather around the Anthony residence, where Kaylee stayed while on bond, Tony decided to revoke her bond and returned her to jail. Leonard further added that Kaylee had not wanted to communicate with him. On September 5, 2008, Kaylee was released again on bail for all pending charges after being fitted with an electronic tracking device. Her $500,000 bond was posted by her parents, who signed a promissory note for the bond. On October 14, 2008, Kaylee was indicted by a grand jury on charges of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of providing false information to police. She was later arrested, and Judge John Jordan ordered that she be held without bond. A week later, the state dropped the child neglect charges because the neglect charges were premised on the theory that Anthony, was still alive. On October 28, Kaylee was arraigned and pleaded not guilty to all charges. On April 13, 2009, prosecutors announced that they planned to seek the death penalty in the case. The prosecution's theory was clear: Kaylee had murdered her daughter, Kaylee, to free herself from the burdens of motherhood. The state's case suggested that Kaylee had used chloroform to subdue her daughter before suffocating her with duct tape. They argued that Kaylee's death was intentional, and that Kaylee staged her disappearance with the nanny story to cover up the crime. Biography.com. The prosecution pointed to key pieces of evidence: the chloroform searches on Kaylee's family computer, the heart-shaped sticker found on the duct tape near Kaylee's mouth, and the presence of decomposition in Kaylee's car. They argued that Kaylee's behavior following her daughter's death, partying, lying to police, and offering inconsistent statements, was not that of a grieving mother, but of someone trying to cover up a cold-blooded crime. However, the defense team, led by Jose Baez, presented an entirely different narrative. They argued that Kaylee's death was an accident, not murder. The defense claimed that Kaylee had drowned in the family pool on June 16, 2008. According to their version of events, Kaylee panicked when she found her daughter in the pool and staged the scene to make it appear as though Kaylee had been kidnapped. The defense also introduced a shocking theory. They claimed that George Anthony, Kaylee's father, was involved in the cover-up. The defense suggested that George may have discovered Kaylee's body and disposed of it to protect Kaylee from being accused of child neglect. They implied that George's actions were motivated by guilt, and that his daughter had been trying to protect him by lying about the events leading up to Kaylee's death. As the trial progressed, the forensic testimony played a significant role. In their dramatic closing arguments, the prosecution focused on Kaylee's behavior after Kaylee's disappearance. They painted a picture of a mother who showed no remorse, who went out partying and got a tattoo saying "Beautiful Life" just days before Kaylee's remains were found. They emphasized that this wasn't the reaction of a mother grieving her lost child, but rather someone who was trying to move on as if nothing had happened. The defense, in turn, attacked the circumstantial evidence, challenging the reliability of the forensic findings and suggesting that the prosecution's theory was based on fantasy forensics. They maintained that there was no clear cause of death, and no evidence to support the claim of murder. Instead, they argued that the evidence pointed to an accidental drowning, and that Kaylee's subsequent actions were driven by fear and confusion rather than malice. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and emotional arguments, the jury reached its verdict. On July 5, 2011, Caylee Anthony was found not guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter, and aggravated child abuse. However, she was convicted on 4 misdemeanor counts for providing false information to law enforcement. The nation was stunned. The moment the verdict was read, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Kaylee's family showed a mixture of emotions, some relief, others disbelief, but the reaction from the public was swift and unambiguous. Across the United States, people sat in shock, unable to comprehend how a mother, whose daughter had been found dead in such tragic circumstances, could be acquitted of the most serious charges. Outside the courthouse, a sea of protesters gathered. Some held signs with phrases like "Justice for Kaylee" and "Guilty of Murder." The general consensus among the public was one of outrage. How could someone who had been accused of such horrific acts walk free? The media frenzy that followed only amplified the anger, with news outlets across the country covering the case non-stop, leaving no stone unturned in their exploration of the trial, the verdict, and the emotional fallout. The media played an undeniable role in shaping public perception throughout the trial and after the verdict. News networks constantly referred to Caylee Anthony as "tot mom," a term coined by television personality Nancy Grace, who made no secret of her belief in Caylee's guilt. The relentless coverage sparked widespread debates about the justice system and whether the jury had made the right decision. Was the prosecution's case strong enough? Did the defense sow too much doubt? The media's portrayal of Caylee's behavior, particularly her partying and seemingly indifferent attitude after Caylee's death, left many people convinced of her guilt. Social media also exploded in the aftermath of the verdict. Millions of people took to Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms to voice their anger, frustration, and confusion. The hashtag Justice for Caylee trended worldwide, as people demanded accountability for what they perceived as a miscarriage of justice. Many felt that Caylee had managed to manipulate the system, escaping conviction despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence against her. Even though the jury acquitted Caylee of the most serious charges, the verdict was seen as an incomplete resolution. Public outrage over the decision spread across every corner of the nation. Many Americans struggled to reconcile the ruling with the facts that had been presented in court, the evidence of neglect, the questionable behavior of Caylee, and the suspicion that justice had not been fully served. The media continued to cover the case in the days and weeks following the verdict, with legal analysts offering their insights into the trial. Some argued that the prosecution had overcharged Caylee, presenting a case that ultimately lacked sufficient evidence to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Others believed that the public's emotional response to the case clouded their judgment, and that the jury's decision was made in accordance with the law. The debate over the trial, the verdict, and the justice system itself would continue for years. Following her release, Caylee Anthony's life remained under intense scrutiny. The public's perception of her was largely negative, with many viewing her as America's most hated mom. Despite this, Caylee attempted to reintroduce herself, expressing a desire to advocate for legal rights and support various social causes. In March 2025, Caylee joined TikTok, aiming to promote her work as a legal advocate and researcher. She expressed intentions to assist individuals facing legal challenges and to honor her late daughter, Caylee's, memory by supporting causes related to women's rights and the LGBTQ community. Beyond the personal, Caylee's tragic death prompted legislative action. Caylee's Law emerged as a proposed statute in several U.S. states, aiming to criminalize the failure of parents or guardians to report a missing child within a specified timeframe. The law sought to ensure timely reporting, facilitating prompt law enforcement responses to potential child endangerment situations. Introduced in multiple states following Caylee Anthony's trial, Caylee's Law sought to impose criminal penalties on parents or guardians who fail to report a missing child within a designated timeframe. The law aimed to ensure that delays in reporting would not hinder law enforcement efforts in recovering missing children. Despite legislative efforts, the haunting question of Caylee's final moments remains unanswered. The lack of definitive information has left a void, fueling public fascination and speculation. The Anthony family's dynamics, strained by the trial and its aftermath, further complicated the pursuit of closure. Caylee's sporadic public appearances, including interviews where she has implicated family members in Caylee's death, have done little to quell public skepticism. Her attempts to reshape her narrative have often been met with criticism, reinforcing her status as a polarizing figure. Thank you for watching the truth behind Caylee Anthony's disappearance, but it's a case that will never be forgotten. Whether you believe in her innocence or guilt, this case has left a permanent mark on our collective consciousness. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Share your thoughts below. What do you think really happened to Kaylee? Stay curious, and I'll see you next time.